Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you to all of you for attending and welcome to our listeners on Radio Al Ansar and Islam TV. It's our pleasure this evening to welcome Professor Anthony Collins, who will be discussing the topic how do we stop the genocide. And I'll speak a little bit more about Professor Collins in a moment. I'd like to call upon Muhammad Bara from the Islamic Forum to render a short Quranic ayah, and inshallah we'll continue after that.
Yeah, take it right on. Yeah.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم أو الوالدين والأقربين إن يكن غنيا أو فقيرا فالله أولى بهما فلا تتبعوا الهوى أن تعدلوا وإن تلووا أو تعرضوا فإن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice and witnesses to Allah, even though it be against yourselves, or your parents, or your kin, be it rich or poor. Allah is protector for both. So follow not your desires, lest you avoid justice. And if you distort your testimony or refuse to give it, verily Allah is well acquainted with what you do. Surah Nisa, verse 135. The next verse is from Surah Ma'idah, verse 8. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط ولا يجرمنكم شنآن قوم على ألا تعدلوا اعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون. O you who believe, stand out firmly for Allah as just witnesses and let not enmity and hatred of others make you avoid justice. Be just, that is nearest to piety, and fear Allah. Verily Allah is well acquainted with what you do. So
Thank you, Muhammad, for those most appropriate verses for the times we find ourselves in, and that is speaking truth to justice. Professor Anthony Collins is an interdisciplinary social scientist whose work explores violence and social justice in the South African and the global South. He's previously at the Trobe University in Australia, but previously lectured as associate professor at DUT and at Rhodes. It's our absolute pleasure to welcome Anthony this evening, and I hope you will find his talk as engaging as some of us did when he first presented it.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for the invite to speak to you. The last 14 months has been a kind of a nightmare. I've worked on violence my entire adult life. I've worked on different kinds of violence, how we understand them, what do we do about them. And I've also specifically worked on genocides, both historical stuff, the Holocaust, a lot of work on the Rwandan genocide. And one of the things that has happened this year, as I've sat for way too many hours on social media, is I realize that that many of us in genocide studies had made a mistake is that we thought if people knew what was happening, it would mean that the genocide wouldn't be able to continue. Because most of the other historical genocides, people only really found out much later. They had to go and do years of research, digging up information that had been hidden, that had been deliberately concealed. And something new has been happening now, is that we can watch every day in Gaza. We can watch what's happening. Horror. We can have a detailed knowledge of the specific events, and it's not stopping. And this is the thing that is on my mind today, is as someone who's thought about genocides, who thinks about violence really every day, what does it mean that we know about this genocide, but we don't know what to do about it? And so I want to just give some ideas. And I want to also just say, in one sense, I'm an expert in this field, but in another sense, I'm a very, very specific individual with a very, very specific and narrow perspective that is not everyone's perspective. Like different personal history, different intellectual interests have led me to frame my understanding in one particular way. And I'm not suggesting that the way I'm going to frame things today is good for everyone. It's just an addition to all the other ways of thinking, all the other conversations, all the other dialogues we could have. And so I'm just going to try and add one particular thing. And so I want to step back from the horror of these visual images, the horror of this knowledge, and say, let's zoom out a little bit. Let's stand back and let's try and understand from a little bit more of an intellectual distance what is happening and what the processes and players are. Okay, so the first thing is, it seems to me there's 4 different ways of relating to Gaza. There's four different groups, broadly speaking, that we can identify. Firstly, there's a group of people who are really actively supporting the genocide. And they're just saying, we want the genocide, we want to drive everyone out of Gaza, we want to ethnically cleanse this area. And they're being really open about that, which is really unusual. It's even genocidal leaders don't usually give the game away. But there are a couple of people that are doing this at the moment. Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich. I mean, this is really unusual that they're just saying it. But there's a much bigger group of people that have a different relation to the genocide. And I want us to mostly think about that group of people. Is people who know that there's a conflict going on, who know that there's a lot of violence, but in their minds, it's not a genocide, it's something else. They're understanding it as being something else. And that's what I'm going to focus on a little bit today, is what's going on with that second group. There's a third group that I want to briefly talk about. And this is probably the biggest group of all, is the people who just don't really want to think about it. The people who just want to have a normal life where they're not freaked out all the time, where they're not enraged or overwhelmed by despair. They just want to try and have a normal life, okay? So, and the way to do that is to not occupy your mind so much with these terrible things. I want to talk a little bit about that group of people. And then the fourth group of people, which in a way I've got the least to say about, is the people who are actively opposed to genocide, because I think they're self-explanatory. And maybe this talk is helpful for those people to understand the second and third group. That's probably what this talk is about. It's to help the people who actively opposed to genocide to understand not the people who are overtly committed to committing a genocide and say it in public, but the people who understand what's going on differently and the people who prefer not to understand at all. Okay. And so that's what I'm going to try and explain. I'm going to try and explain that each of these positions kind of lives in a different world, a different mental world. And I want to understand something about those mental worlds. Okay, so who's extremists? Okay, this particular far-right government that has seized power in Israel, there's a kind of been a move amongst Israeli youth towards a kind of new forms of kind of radical racism, new kinds of nationalist narratives, which are not only confined to Israel. These kinds of right-wing, militant, racist movements are actually happening in many countries throughout the world. But the specific manifestation in acts of genocide seems to be most clear in the case of Gaza. So there's that group of extremists. I'm not going to talk much about them because I don't think we can do much about them except either kill them or put them in jail. Like literally, I think our options are limited with that group. But I also think that group is very small. I think they really are much smaller than we think. But they're very powerful. That's the problem. But they get their power from other groups. Okay, that extremist group gets their power from other groups that are not extremist. Okay, so the big group then is these kind of Zionist sympathizers. And these are people who believe that Israel's a good idea, that they believe, and I'm going to talk about this, why they think the project of the state of Israel is a good idea. And essentially, they kind of believe Zionist propaganda and the victim ideology of Zionism, which I'll talk about later. There's another really interesting group of people which we ignore, and I think we ignore them at our risk, is a lot of people who support the genocide are fundamentalist Christians. They're a particular group of particularly American Messianic Christians. And they see what's going on in Israel-Palestine as part of a kind of a messianic biblical prophecy. And they kind of into it in the sense that it is bringing about their end of days, their biblical kind of apocalypse, which they are actively seeking. And so they see themselves as theologically connected to the Zionist project. So there's that group. Then there's these other kind of cynical groups. US politicians, and I distinguish US politicians from United States public, because it's really interesting that when surveys are done, there's a real difference in what the political leadership are doing in relation to the genocide and what the public actually wants. There's plenty of evidence that most of the public want the genocide to end, that they want the US to stop arming Israel. Those are quite widely held beliefs, but the politicians will have none of it. They are absolutely committed, and they're committed for a number of reasons. Okay, the one is just absolutely practical economic imperialist reason, is that for the US to maintain its kind of world domination, it needs to maintain the petrodollar, it needs to maintain its control over the oil-producing parts of the Middle East. And Israel is a forward military base for that project. It's essential. It's an essential military base as part of an economic project that extends into, you know, the overthrow of Iraq, the occupation of Afghanistan. All of that is part of this of what is essentially a strategic military economic project. But they're also playing a kind of an economic interests game and appeasing their voters game. And the two very, very powerful political lobbies that can get you knocked out of the running as a political candidate are AIPAC, which is the Zionist political lobby in the US, and the fundamentalist Christian lobby. They alongside kind of weapons, those are the two big political lobbies that have influence. And then there's this other group, which I have to confess, I just can't say anything about it. I do not yet understand them, which is German politicians. Germany has become, to my mind, just completely insane in relation to the genocide. They've essentially criminalized even saying the word genocide or describing what is happening in Palestine. And there seems to be two things going on there. The one thing, the obvious thing, is that Germany's kind of caught in this, in their guilt about the Holocaust, and they haven't really managed to process that. But it seems to me there's something else, which this is highly speculative, is one of the things that the Holocaust raises is like, okay, so Germany wants to kind of make reparation for the Holocaust, so they want Jews to be safe, never again, all of that. And so Jewish people need to have their safe space somewhere. And the immediate question is, well, where? And the immediate answer, I think that would seem logical, is, well, the place they were ethnically cleansed from, i.e. Germany. And so I wonder if what's part of the derangement about their unequivocal support of Israel is the fact that they need Jewish people to not be in Germany. So it's actually an extension of the Holocaust, that the commitment to Israel while performing a kind of a regret about the Holocaust is actually an extension of it. But that's purely me speculating, and I wouldn't be able to justify that in a debate. But, okay, having identified these different things, I want to then break down another set of categories, okay, that there are different kinds of support, and this is going to become important. There's the kind of ideological support, the people who believe in the project of Israel, believe Israel's a good thing, believe the ethnic cleansing of Palestine's a good thing. So that's at the level of beliefs, okay? Then there's the kind of financial support for the genocide, and then there's the military support for the genocide. And I think it's worth looking at each of these things separately, okay? But before we do that, I want to make one very, very important distinction. And I think it's really important to emphasize this distinction because people who don't want you to make this distinction, okay, is that Judaism is not Zionism. The project of Israel is a Zionist project, not a Jewish project, okay? Firstly, most Zionists are not actually Jewish people. They are these Messianic Christian fundamentalists, the huge majority of them, okay? Secondly, a lot of Jewish people are anti-Zionist. Most of them are Zionist, but there's really, really significant groups that are anti-Zionist, okay? So we mustn't confuse them on that level. Secondly, Zionism is a very, very new political project historically, whereas Judaism is a very ancient religion historically. That Zionism got imposed on Judaism only in the last 150 years. And it had to be actively marketed towards the Jewish community. There was no natural good fit between the emergence of political Zionism and Judaism. Okay, and one of the reasons is because Zionism contradicts some of the fundamental principles of Jewish theology. Okay, firstly, a core to traditional Jewish theology is the divine ordination that the Jewish people should be a people amongst the nations. It was God's will for them to be dispersed across the earth and to be amongst other communities. This is kind of classical Judaic theology. Okay, and secondly, that at the core of Jewish theology, as with across the Abrahamic religions is a fundamental commitment towards kind of social justice, caring about people, and often this is articulated within the Jewish tradition in terms of the notion of tikkun olam, which we can translate as healing the world. That this is one of the primary ethical drivers of Judaism, is that it is a religious practice towards social justice, towards making the world a better place and towards caring about people. And to try and make that fit with Zionism involves a huge amount of kind of gymnastics, which was very difficult for the Zionists to do. And initially, when Zionists started trying to go to Jewish communities and say, oh, we want to start the state of Israel, and they didn't even know where they went to. They were like, we're going to do it in Madagascar or Uganda or in southern United States, before they settled on Palestine. Jewish communities widely rejected this Zionist political project. And there's this famous quote where the kind of political Zionists were like taking European Jewish communities on tours of Palestine and be like, oh, this is going to be our national home. And the word that was transmitted back by the people who'd been on these kind of colonial safaris, or whatever you want to call them, is captured in this quote: the bride is beautiful, but she's married to another man. Okay, which simply means that this would be a great place for us, but it's someone else's home already, and we can't just go in and take over someone else's. This was an Orthodox Jewish belief, that it was wrong to go and try and take over someone else's homeland. And political Zionism had to do a lot of work to defeat that belief. Okay, the reason I stress this is because at the core of the Zionist project is the deliberate attempt to make people believe that Zionism and Judaism are the same thing. It's a deliberate political project to collapse Zionism and Judaism. And I think it's really important that we separate them. In exactly the same way that, there was a political project of trying to collapse ISIS and Islam. I mean, this was a US imperialist political project to say these are the same thing. Islam is ISIS, is Al-Qaeda, is terrorism. It's exactly the same kind of collapse of things that are fundamentally different from each other, that we really need to keep those things separate. Okay, so different problems need different strategies. Okay, ideological, economic, and military opposition to the genocide need us to think differently and to understand differently. Okay, so in terms of the ideological project, what we've got to understand is that Zionism depends on the idea that Zionism is legitimate. Now, it may be that no one in this room believes that Zionism is legitimate, but a lot of very powerful people in the United States, Germany, those countries do believe that it's legitimate, and that legitimacy is essential to making it possible, because that legitimacy also makes possible the other things, which are the economic viability of the genocide. One of the things that we need to know is that war, apartheid, genocide, systems of social inequality, they're actually very expensive. They don't come cheap. Weapons of war involve a huge amount of expense, a huge amount of destruction. Not only are the weapons expensive, but the amount of other harm they do creates secondary kind of costs. So for the genocide to continue, it's got to continue being funded, and we need to look at that very specifically. And related to that, these two are inextricable, is that that these kind of projects, these very, very violent projects, war projects, genocide projects, need a massive and constant supply of weapons. And without weapons, they also collapse. So these three things have to be in place for the genocide to carry on. It's got to maintain ideological legitimacy among certain powerful groups globally. it's got to maintain financial resources and support, and it's got to maintain access to this massive supply of weapons of mass destruction, okay? And if we want to think about ending the genocide, we need to think about how we could intervene in each of those three categories, in the ideological legitimacy, in the economic viability, and in the supply of military hardware. So let me just say a little bit about the military question, okay? Because I've weirdly had conversations in the last few weeks with people who have wanted to persuade me that the Palestinian resistance is on the verge of military success. That Israel's resources are depleted, that Hamas and Hezbollah have massive stockpiles of weapons. Israel's getting weaker, they're getting stronger. There's going to be a military defeat of the Zionist state. I don't know factually enough to assess that, but my intuition is that is a absolute, that's a fantasy, okay? That there's no reasonable prospect of defeating the kind of Zionist genocidal project simply because there's no prospect of defeating the United States. What you need to understand is the United States is not only, I mean, it's literally the biggest military in human history. They spend as much on their military as the next 10 biggest countries' militaries put together. All of them together are not the size, or don't cost as much as the US's military. It just seems crazy to me that the idea that the US can be beaten in battle. Obviously, it can be beaten in other ways. It can be defeated in other ways. It can be defeated in the way that it was in Vietnam and the way that it was in Afghanistan. There are other kinds of kind of military defeat, but a straight out kind of success, victory in combat, that model, I can't see it, and maybe I'm wrong. But what worries me about that model is even if that were possible, even if military victory by the resistance were possible, the cost is what worries me. Is that the people who are going to die are not going to be the soldiers doing the genocide. It's going to be the people in the resistance. They are going to, the cost to them, the cost to their families, the cost to the worlds they live in is going to be much, much, much greater. And I just personally don't feel like I can sign off on that cost. Okay. So the idea of end the genocide through military victory, I don't want to make that argument, okay? But what's interesting, what worries me is that the military resistance to the genocide confirms part of the justification of the genocide to the minds of Zionist imperialists, okay? It confirms that they are under threat. And I think we must look very carefully at the cost of confirming to people who are inside a conspiracy theory that some of the beliefs in their conspiracy theory are true. So, yeah, as I say there, I'm just more of a pacifist, so I'm not going to say much more about that. On the other hand, I think it is cool that Hitler got defeated militarily. I mean, I will accept that as an argument. So I'm going to walk away from this part of the thing. And I'm going to get on to the next thing, which is the law. Can we do something about the genocide through the system of law? And this is where the South African government has really been on the front foot, right? I mean, literally, we were the folks who, out of 196 countries in the world, we were the ones who went to the International Court of Justice and said, the crime of genocide is being committed. Here's the evidence. You need to prosecute this, okay? And following that, many countries joined in. Then, in addition to the International Court of Justice, the ICC then brought the warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant. And so there are these international legal instruments, okay, and they have sometimes worked in some ways, but for those of us who've been holding our breath since, early January last year, it's not looking like this is going to be the immediate solution, okay? That certainly the ICC may well convict certain of the war criminals involved, but what it'll do much more than that is it will provide guidance for other states. It'll provide guidance for these states who are kind of half inside the Zionist ideology and half inside a universal human rights ideology, and they kind of balance between the two. And it will enable them to say, oh yeah, we really can say out loud that this is a genocide, which many people in the West don't feel like they have permission to say that yet. But the International Court of Justice can give them that permission, and perhaps the International Criminal Court can give them that permission. But in the short term, that's not going to end the genocide between now and the end of this year, that's for sure. Okay. There's also kind of national laws that we can use. That most countries have some sort of national human rights laws and conventions. They belong to conventions that give them international obligations. Things around, sale of weapons. Things around participating in the in activities with other countries. There's all kinds of internal things that can be brought. And we've seen this in Europe, that some people have brought court cases against their governments for supplying weapons to Israel. And I think in the case of the Netherlands and perhaps a few other places, those have actually been successful. The other thing is that people can bring kind of private civil legal cases against those who are supporting genocide. And that's a whole area. So lawfare as a tactic, yes, certainly there's some scope for it. There's been some successes already. At the point where the ICJ makes its ruling, that really will be significant. If someone ever hands Netanyahu over to the International Criminal Court, that would really be a game changer. But it's not going to happen very soon that I can see. So we need to be working on the lawfare. But it's not going to save us. Okay. Then the question of weapons. Okay. Israel is a major producer of weapons, but also specifically of cyber war technology. I mean, this is the surveillance cyber war state almost. But it's nowhere near being able to manufacture on its own the weapons it needs to carry on executing the genocide. Okay, so it has to be supplied weapons by other countries, and that makes it vulnerable to those countries stopping supplying the weapons. There's two kind of reasons people supply weapons. One, because they are kind of politically sympathetic to the project, and it's not just countries, but also companies, the ones that are just in it for the cash. I mean, weapons, the big lucrative business. Okay, so what we're seeing though is that most of the weapons that Israel is getting, they're actually getting more than 2/3 of their weapons from the US. So the project of interrupting the weapons supply would need to also be a project that addressed the US's commitment to Zionist imperialism. Okay. Germany was supplying pretty much all of the other third, but interestingly, they've really been scaling that back now. They haven't been making a fuss about it, but they actually have significantly been scaling back their arms supply. And then a bunch of other European countries, Italy, UK, France, Spain, have been quite active also, but the quantities that they're supplying are not. They're not critical. They're not going to end the genocide if those European countries simply pull out, and they have to some extent been pulling out. Certainly Spain, Netherlands, France, not really. UK, who knows? They're pretending but not actually doing. It's very weird what's going on there. Okay, so an arms embargo would end the genocide, and it would end it, I think, really quickly. Probably, I don't know, in a few days. definitely in a few weeks. If we could pull off an arms embargo, if we could get, even if we could just get Germany and the United States to be like, no, we out. That's it. Genocide stops in its tracks because it's just the weapons aren't there. But it's exceptionally difficult to achieve. There's reasons why getting the US and Germany to stop supplying those weapons actually is not easy. And they're not going to, I don't know, maybe Germany would, but the US is not going to stop when the ICJ rules that it is a genocide. The US is already well into denouncing the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. They're not even signatories to the ICC. But the project of interrupting the arms supply is an interesting one and possibly a fruitful one. And what we've seen in a number of places, in Australia, in the UK, we've seen direct citizen action. Like people are just going, they're blockading the arms suppliers, they're stopping arms being loaded onto ships, they're actually breaking into the buildings of like Elbit systems and sabotaging them. And I mean, this is real kind of citizen action that is happening. I mean, the state response has been catastrophic. They're charging like kids with terrorism and stuff for this direct action against the weapons manufacturers. But it does seem that there's something going on there. There's a kind of instability, vulnerability going on there, as there is in taking legal action against the suppliers of weapons. Okay, so this is a site of intervention, and linked to that is an intervention around money. Okay, as I said before, wars are really, really, really expensive, and they risk bankrupting countries. And in a sense, I mean, I think back in South Africa, you know, the apartheid state didn't collapse because of MK. MK had a role to play, but they ultimately collapsed because it was not a financially viable project, that they were going bankrupt because of a whole lot of things. The cost of the repressive apparatus, the cost of the war, the cost of sanctions. And they kind of took a strategic decision to be like, well, if we want to keep the cash, we've got to cut this racist political structure loose. I think Israel is vulnerable in that same way. And we certainly are seeing a negative impact in the economy. We've watched over the last year economic growth declining. We've watched the international rating agencies downgrade Israel. So the signs of economic vulnerability are there. But of course, at the same time, there's this strong economic support. There's aid from a number of other Western countries, once again, especially the United States and Germany. There's kind of individual contributions from the Jewish diaspora. But there seems a point of vulnerability and instability there. And this is precisely why one of the kind of organizing networks that the Zionist machinery has gone after most desperately has been BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions networks. Okay, but this is a functioning international network that is organizing everything from kind of consumer boycotts. You can get a little app on your phone that says this product you're about to buy was manufactured in the occupied territories, or this kind of supports this Israeli company. So even at the level of individual financial decisions, when you go, you know, to Checkers, you can be taking part in having economic impacts on the viability of the genocidal project. Okay. Even more so than that, the idea of divestment has been very powerful. Getting big sort of investment entities to start pulling their investments out of Israel because of public pressure. And Jeff, you were saying the Norwegian Sovereign Fund has now, I mean, that's epic amount of money. I can't even imagine how much money that they're pulling out now. And this is happening all over. The people are, their investments, their pension schemes, everything, they're pressurizing those financial networks to disinvest from things that are ultimately linked to the viability of the genocide. Okay, and the other is sanctions, and obviously sanctions happen more at the state level, but getting countries to simply cut off, and not only at state level, many universities, are breaking ties with the with universities that are linked to kind of Zionist militarism, but all of these, boycotting, divesting, and instituting sanctions, these are things that actually worked quite effectively against apartheid, and they may be able to work pretty effectively in this case, because they go to the really central thing is if the financial viability of the genocide collapses, then the genocide collapses. But obviously, none of us individually have the power to bring about that kind of collapse. But we certainly have the power to be part of networks, to be making choices, to be involved with activism, to be putting pressure on financial entities, on governments to be making these changes. So this is a whole another area of possible intervention which we can talk about. But the one that I'm really here to talk to you about today is the one that I'm an expert on. I'm not an expert on the military industry. I'm not an expert on economics, but I am an expert on ideological legitimation, which is simply really the kind of stuff people believe about the world, like the ways in which they interpret the world as being good or bad or justifiable and unjustifiable. And that's where I can probably say the most expert things, okay? And what interests me is that many people in the West, I don't know if it's most people in the West, believe that the Zionist project is justified. They believe that, and when I say the Zionist project, I mean in its full genocidal manifestation. And what's interesting is they don't believe that because they are insane. They don't believe that because they're psychopaths. They don't believe that because they are explicit kind of racists who just want to, kill anyone who's not like a white European. They believe that because of a whole lot of other beliefs that are much more complex, okay? And that's what I'm interested in. Firstly, a lot of their justification in their minds is related to a kind of Western guilt about anti-Semitism, that there's been this like 1,000 years of Western anti-Semitism. It's been a huge part of European society in a way that it wasn't in Middle Eastern society. I mean, anti-Semitism is really a kind of something that comes out of Europe. And of course, that anti-Semitism kind of culminated in the Holocaust, and that culminated in the kind of the Europe kind of having a meltdown about itself, as being like, oh shit, look at what we've done. Who's going to clean up this mess? This is crazy. We weren't supposed to do this. And so this sort of horror, regret, remorse about anti-Semitism leading up to the Holocaust is a huge kind of part of this idea of saying, well, because that was bad, Israel's a really good idea, okay? And we need to pick apart how they jumped from the one to the other, how they jumped from like the Holocaust was a really bad idea to Israel's a really good idea. The other part of it is theological. A lot of people, a lot of the sort of ideological justification of Zionism, as I said, comes out of this kind of messianic Christianity, and that this is prophesied in the Bible. There's going to be a war in the Middle East. The Messiah is going to come. All of that's going to happen, and so it's part of people's theology. There's another discourse which you will be very familiar with. This thing that gets said all the time: Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. You heard that statement. I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's psychotic, right? I mean, A, Israel isn't a democracy, and B, there are lots of democracies in the Middle East, all problematic in their own way. But this idea that Israel somehow represents a last stand of democracy against this kind of collapse into tyranny, political repression, barbarism, whatever it is. And this is really deeply believed amongst by a lot of Western people. And I don't have time, but if you want, I'll talk to you about why they believe that, because they've always believed that. For them, this is like they're like the fairy story they grew up with, because they always believed that about colonialism, and now they believe it about Zionist colonialism. And right at the bottom of all of that, all of this ties together with this idea that Israel is a victim. That Israel is just trying to be democratic. It's just trying to free Jewish people from anti-Semitism. It's just trying to be a democracy amongst people who don't want democracy. And in that sense, the entire understanding of Israel is the understanding of Israel is defending itself against a hostile surrounding world. Okay? And having said that, I think one of the nice things, I hope I don't have to explain to you why each one of those beliefs is empirically false. Okay, I often talk to people I do have to explain that to, and I'm not going to bother with that today. Okay, so this is the question that interests me. This is my kind of intellectual work. How do people come to believe claims that have no basis in reality? Because they do it a lot, not just in this claim. People do this a lot. They believe stuff that has got nothing to do with what's actually happening in the real world, but it's got nothing to do with like scientific facts. They just believe stuff. So I want to unpack that a little bit, and that's kind of where I'm going to go and end today. Okay. So the first thing is, without wanting to give you a big cultural and media studies lecture, is that people don't believe stuff because they made it up. They didn't sit in their bedroom and make up this idea. The idea was around them, okay? The idea was something that was given to them, it was made available, it was normalized around them, okay? So people come to experience the world through a way of understanding that is deeply part of their culture, that is also increasingly deeply part of the communication systems, the communication technologies around them, as in addition to the cultural traditions. And when we start seeing that, it also becomes clear that these two different versions of Israel-Palestine are really based on two different versions of history, which is the Western version of the last few hundred years of world history and the Global South's version of the last few hundred years of world history, which is essentially the colonizers' version and the colonized version. And those two standpoints, the standpoint of the colonizer and standpoint of the colonized, make the world look completely different depending on which you're standing in, okay? I've done a whole nother paper on that. You can, it's all on YouTube. You can go look there if you want. Okay, a critical specific part of this is a kind of an underlying sense of trauma, of what is like the terrible thing that we need to avoid in the world, okay? And for Western people, the terrible thing we need to avoid in the world is doing the Holocaust again, okay? And the Holocaust kind of really discredited racism, it discredited imperialism, it discredited the colonial project. Kind of all of that started changing. But for people in the Global South, the fundamental bad thing in the world that we've got to avoid and got to stop is the experience of colonization. People in the West, they're like, well, colonization was nice. Like, what's the name? The head of the DA. Helen Ziller. But colonization brought a lot of good stuff to South Africa. I mean, she is the classic voice of like the colonizer's perspective on apartheid. Okay, and the world's full of them. Versus this kind of colonialism was the worst thing that ever happened, and we've got to stop that ever happening again. And so essentially Israel is being read either as a solution to the Holocaust or as more colonialism. That's really the big split. That's the interpretative split. Okay. And linked to that is these new sources of information, because in addition to just like learning stuff from your parents and your community and the people at school, there's been a kind of a splitting apart of like traditional centralized Western media, like the big newspapers, the New York Times, Washington Post, and this new kind of emergent social media-based digital citizen journalism. Everyone's got a cell phone. You can film the cops shooting a black guy on the streets of New York. You can film what's happening to your family in Gaza. This is kind of a radical change in reality. That stuff is no longer coming through these highly organized, controlled systems of information, and there's now this kind of chaotic, like Bisan can go on Instagram and I will know 1 minute later. Okay, this is a new thing in the world. But it's not as simple as that, because it's also being controlled. The algorithms are being controlled by the social media companies. Zionist lobby are like in with Meta controlling Facebook and Instagram feeds. The US government is busy banning TikTok because they can't control it. So it's complicated, right? But there's something new and disruptive going on there. And what it's coming out as is a kind of break in the West between the older generation and the younger generation. So the Zionist ideological project is like totally like acceptable to the older generation. The kids aren't buying it anymore. Increasingly, the young people are just like, that's not what I can see with my own eyes when I follow these citizen journalists in Palestine. And so they're not accepting those versions of reality. But the versions of reality depend on these emergent technologies and the attempts to control them and the failure to control them. Okay, so to loop back to the kind of the core of this Western understanding, which is the thing that I talked about as being like the second big group, the group of very, very powerful people who kind of think Israel's a good idea and are not prepared to say, well, it's a good idea, but it shouldn't really be also doing genocide. They kind of like, whoa, we don't want to get controversial here. Okay, so as I said before, it's got to do with this idea of anti-Semitic persecution and the Holocaust, leading to the idea that, well, what the West has to do is to reverse that. They have to ensure that Jewish people have a safe place of their own where they can be autonomous, where they can defend themselves against threats. Because that's what they couldn't do during the Nazi era. They couldn't do during the Holocaust. Okay, so they've got to do it now. Linked to that is this kind of background, theological, historical sense that the Jewish people are somehow linked to that part of the Middle East, that, you know, they were there in some weird way 2,500 years ago, and their God also said to them, well, luckily you can have that area and you can genocide people there, and we'll all be cool with that. So there's that kind of background idea, that the idea that there's a historical and theological link to that to that land. Okay, and that then is sort of dovetails the thing that I talked about before, is that the typical Western view is, what was the problem with colonialism? We brought you all this good stuff. You know, we made hospitals and roads and slavery. Oh, no, forget about the slavery. So the idea of taking indigenous land and putting Western people on it, that's the first step. That's the first principle. That's colonialism 101. That's what you do. You say like, oh, there's no one here. We can have it. Okay. Literally, Captain Cook arrived in Australia, declared the terra nullius, empty land, you know, because the indigenous people, they weren't people. Okay. So, and that's what the whole project about. So the idea, well, yes, okay. So the people living there, but Europe will just decide to give it to to become this Jewish state. We'll like the British will sign Balfour Declaration, United Nations will endorse this, like, oh, okay, we'll make that state of Israel. Doesn't, and have you heard this thing, this Zionist argument? There's never been a state of Palestine. There's never been a country there. There are no Palestinians. No, like literally, I think several of the prime ministers have actually said the words, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. And yeah. Yeah, this is a founding phrase of Zionism. A land without people for people without a land. Okay, so literally, this fantasy that there was no one there, that in fact it wasn't even Palestine, it was just empty land. It was just empty land waiting for people who God had promised it to come back and set up their homes there. And because they believe all of that, okay, because they believe all of that, they interpret the reaction to that in a particular way. So they were just, well, we were just coming back to the empty land that God gave us in our religious texts, and then people started fighting with us. Like they started like not wanting to flee from their homes and not, opposing us settling in our empty land. And so they come up with this is the critical thing. This is the critical conclusion they reach, okay, from this colonial fantasy position. Well, the violence is not because of anything we've done, and we aren't the ones doing the violence. The violence is because people just hate us, because they always did hate us in Europe. They were always anti-Semitic. They persecuted us. They put us in death camps. So the reason there's violence in Israel, Palestine, is because Arabs hate Jews, and that's the end point of that fantasy. Okay. And it's also really important, okay, the use of the word Arabs. I've also done a whole nother thing on like the Zionist use of the word Arabs. Because whenever someone uses a word, you must look at what word they're trying not to use. Like a word always stands in place of another word. And the word Arab stands in place, of course, the word Palestinian, because you can't say the word Palestinian, because then oh, shit, it's Palestine, it's their home, shit. What are we going to do? So it's just Arabs. Okay, so it's Arabs. So Arabs hate Jews, and this is in the Zionist fantasy and in the Western imagination. This explains why the conflict in the Middle East. Okay. The other critical aspect of this is that also means the Zionists are the victims. They're just trying to live. They're just trying to go to the land God gave them and make it flourish. And people are just causing shit with them. Okay. They want to live in peace and safety, but these anti-Semites just keep wanting to harm them. And this, you've got to really understand what it is like for people to absolutely believe that is the truth about the world. They deeply believe that. They're not saying it cynically. They're not like, well, we're going to try and scam people by saying this, even though it's not true. I mean, there are people who are doing that. I mean, certainly Netanyahu, when he says that, it's absolutely scammery. He's deliberately telling lies to manipulate people. But your general kind of suburban person in the West just really thinks this is the truth about reality. Okay? And from that, we get this phrase that we have all heard too much in the last 14 months, that Israel has a right to defend itself. Okay, this is a logical end point of this fantasy world. Okay, now I think it's really important to understand that. I think it's really, really important, because the people who are inside this world, who are inside this ideological system, are the people who are doing the other stuff that's making the genocide happen. Firstly, they're providing a moral justification for it. Israel has the right to defend itself. Secondly, they're providing the economic means for the genocide to continue. And thirdly, they are directly contributing the weapons to make the genocide happen. So if we can get inside that system of power and that sort of ideological world and dismantle it, we should be able to set all the dominoes falling down to where the genocide is impossible. And once again, maybe I'm totally wrong about that, but I think that might be a really interesting strategy. Okay, so I'm getting closer to the end now because I've been talking for a really long time. Okay, so essentially, I'm making a really interesting argument. I'm arguing that Zionism is a conspiracy theory. And in conspiracy theories, people do not change their minds because of facts. If someone's a flat earther, you can't say, yeah, but look here, you can see the curvature of the earth in this photo. They'll come up with another explanation. You can't convince anti-vaxxers that, there's, thousands of research data. It just doesn't work. There's always a story built into the conspiracy theory about why the facts are wrong. Okay. And that's the danger of just trying to say yes, but the facts are this. Okay. And the point I started with is individuals don't make up this belief system on their own. They are in a continuously supported culture and media that does that. And one of the things that it does, and this is why I've made this point so strongly before, is it collapses Judaism and Zionism. It says that persecution of the Jews, bad. Judaism and Zionism are the same thing. Therefore, Zionism, good. Okay. And that's why we have to really radically separate those two things out. Of course, it has the effect of like Palestinians are either have never existed or aren't human in some way. Okay. I don't know what we're supposed to say about that. And this idea of Zionists are victims. But most importantly, it leads to this point that when people are presented with evidence, and it was so interesting, I was at a panel 2 weeks ago with this Palestinian guy and this Jewish American guy and some other sort of people, who work on similar issues. And there was a photo on the overhead. And the one was a Palestinian mom and her young child from the 1920s, and another was a Palestinian mom and a young child from this year. And the stark contrast between this kind of rich cultural tradition, maternal family caring, and the absolute brutal violence of how families have been torn apart, children have been deliberately killed. And it was so interesting that the Jewish American guy, and people were being really honest. I mean, they held different opinions, but they were being honest. And the chair of the panel said, "Tell me what your reaction to the images is." And this Jewish American guy said something really interesting. He said, "My first reaction is I didn't believe it." And we've got to understand that you can get on TikTok, you can get on Instagram, you can follow the citizen journalists on the ground in Gaza, you can see those images, but other people can see those same images and be like, that's fake. That's propaganda. That's deliberate misinterpretation of what's really happening. Israel's the most moral army in the world. They would never do that, okay? So they literally... and this is the way in which it's a conspiracy theory. It is already prepared in advance the refutation of anything that might challenge it. It's got a story about why that's not true. This is anti-Semitic propaganda. It's just all lies. And so we've got to understand how difficult it is to reach into that world, because you can't reach into it just by saying, look, like here, look, just look at these pictures. Just Ignore the rest of the stuff there. So here's a practical question. Can we present the alternative view as an invitation rather than a threat? Because that's one of the things we tend to do wrong. Because we are so angry, outraged, that we want to, the first emotional impulse is to punish people and to like shake them and like make them see. But is it possible to present people with an alternative to their existing worldview in a way that doesn't feel like an assault to them, but feels like an invitation to a better opportunity? Especially because part of knowing that stuff, part of being a Zionist and actually knowing what's going on in Gaza will necessarily bring you extreme shame and grief and regret. Okay, that would be inescapable. And people don't like feeling that stuff. Okay. And one of the things you have to do to be able to do that is there has to be alternative communities to the existing communities. There has to be something that replaces the family, the social networks, the faith-based networks, okay, to allow people to feel like they could still be a person with other people as they shifted through the changing of their belief systems, okay. I was going to talk to you also about the biggest group of all, the people who just would prefer not to know. Just like, it's too upsetting. Off social media, it freaks me out. Okay. But there's no time. I'll talk to you about it another time, or you can ask me questions about it. But they're the solutions. It comes to the question, how can we make people take something terrible seriously while making it not traumatic for them? That is the practical question there. Okay. I'm not going to explain the circle defeats a straight line either now. Okay. A couple of tips at the end of this that I think. Firstly, as a general principle with violence, don't let the aggressor define the terms of the engagement. Okay. Don't let genocidal Zionists define how you have to resist genocide. Don't be lured into playing their game. Okay. You don't have to oppose violence only using other violence. There's multiple imaginative alternatives. Secondly, and I think this is really, really, really important, the problem is not people. The problem is systems. The problem is ideological systems, political systems, economic systems. I try to show that right through, is that those systems, the economic interests in the Middle East, the ideological systems of the West, those systems, it's not like, oh, the problem is that these are bad people and we need to punish them for being bad. The problem is we need to work out how to dismantle the system. Okay, so essentially what I'm saying there is we need to understand the mechanisms that support the violence and the weaknesses and vulnerabilities in those systems. If we understand what makes those systems work, we can understand how to dismantle those systems. And one of the systems is the ideological system. If we understand the belief systems and identities that motivate people to either engage in violence or to support other people's violence or to justify violence, if we can understand those, that's the first step towards helping those people find their way out of being trapped in that ideological system, in that conspiracy theory, in that worldview where they think they are the victims and everyone else is the perpetrator, even though they are actually fundamentally the aggressor all along, but they can't see that. And that's what I wanted to leave you with today.
Thanks to Professor Collins. Just to maybe give you an update on what we're going to do. Firstly, at the end, we will be having Isha Salah, of course, after some breaks. I'm going to ask Mohammed to just set up a small presentation we wanted to do as well. And then, of course, we'll take question and answers. Just clarification. I've been looking at my WhatsApps and people sending me questions about Syria. It's a conundrum within a bigger conundrum. And I think for the purposes of this evening, when there are time for questions for Prof. Collins, I would ask you, please. I know it's people are bursting with anxiety and interest as to what is happening there, but not for tonight. I think maybe we can look at what's happening in Syria at another time, and a much wider discussion. But for this evening, during questions, please let's limit it to perhaps what Prof. Collins was speaking to. And Mohammed, do you want to set up? And that is, there's the how. There's the how we can dismantle the systems, how we can address some of the issues. So, Prof alluded to the fact that in our own country you have the community that is well known, supports Israel financially, but also sends their young men to go fight in the army, and that's been going on for decades. We're not doing that, and we are clearly, people are praying, people are sending money to organizations like Gift of the Givers, trying to get in humanitarian aid. We're organizing as the Islamic Medical Association with our colleagues overseas, volunteers to get into Gaza and organizing relief, etc. But there is the one thing that is outstanding, and that is what we can do with our little mobile phones. Prof alluded to the fact that, they can't control TikTok, so therefore they need to either buy it out or shut it down, make it an issue of American national security as the justification for that. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes just chatting about. Yeah, please. What we can, some of the things we can be doing. One is clearly what we're doing this evening, and that is raising awareness. The other is contributing towards advocacy. Clearly, whether legally or not, none of us are, and Prof. Khan said is a pacifist, but none of us are saying let's send our children there to go fight, which is another argument I've been told we should have been doing. But anyway, let us talk a little bit about advocacy that you can do. That it's school holidays, you can be talking to your young children, your university students on holiday, your matriculants and other young people who are sitting at home, and how you can use some of the issues. For example, I know from discussions that the president is under enormous pressure. So is Minister Roland Lamola. We can be sending them support. Yes, we have serious problems with the ANC in other issues. Clearly upset with the ANC over many other things. But on this particular one, as Prof said, 196 countries, this is the one country that withstood pressure on AGOA, on threats internally. I should tell you that between WITS and UCT, for having those Gaza students have lost 30 million in the past 2 months in bequeaths from the Zionist supporting community. We know that Saj Board is taking the UCT to court. WITS is under huge pressure. You would have seen an attack on Professor Mahdi, attacks on Imtiaz Suleiman of the Gift of the Givers. This is not coincidental. It's part of making sure that the traction for BDS, the traction for support for Gaza does not happen. But what you can be doing is come and help us to increase social media activism, to increase the kind of responses that one wants to see on social media, on some of the... I think as Mohammed has put here very aptly, this is not going to happen with the stroke of a weapon or just, on one or two things. It's death by 1,000 cuts. And one of those 1,000 cuts is the type of exposure, the type of breaking down the trolls, etc., that happen on social media. Echo chambers. I think all of us can see sometimes what happens on internal WhatsApp groups. We have to translate that energy, that non-enclosed WhatsApp groups into more public. And to her credit, tries to work in the Christian community. And Roseanne, maybe during questions and answer times, will tell you how hard it is to break down some of those mental barriers and inherent indoctrination Prof. Collins spoke to you about. And this is from the Christian community. This is where we can be engaging, perhaps talking about an alternative way other than just saying, these are barbaric Zionists and they should all be punished, which they should. But as an alternative framing, perhaps those are the sort of things we can do. Prof spoke about controlling and dictating the narrative. I sort of listen to SFM the whole day as much as I can, and you can already see control of the narrative. Now, that's a public channel that yours and ours taxpayers fund, and we should be putting pressure on SABC. And the fact of the news is not by coincidence, right? I think you know that that's a lot of external pressure that has come to bear on the SABC. I'm going to give you a very simple example. A few weeks ago, when the Amsterdam thing broke out, I was driving and I heard the sportscaster, John Gericke, say, he really framed, and this was just when it happened sort of live, he took a Sky News report and said, these Arabs are attacking Israeli supporters for the football match in Amsterdam. And as soon as I could, I sort of Googled very quickly because and it was framed so badly. Anyway, long story short, as everybody knows, the story was then coming out clearly, and we complained to the BCCSA to say that you had no follow-up stories, you had no we spoke about political activism, about constant support, even for our own government as far as this goes. We already see the AGOA stick being dangled in front of the South African government. So we need your young people particularly, but of course, absolutely everybody else. Nobody is too old to learn how to do something on social media. And of course, as Mohammed has put there, more people in strategic places. So Discovery is having the AGM, right? All of us know that summit that Discovery held in Cape Town a few weeks ago with this organization from Israel, whose 4 doctors who came here were all part of the IDF. One was a colonel, a combat surgeon. One was a colonel in the army. And notwithstanding your protestations, Discovery clearly could not have known this, but went ahead. Now Discovery has its AGM. This is an opportunity for members of the Discovery Medical Aid to go to that AGM and say, we are now wanting to vote for people who aren't going to allow such a thing at a board level. And this is where, whether it's the UCT Senate, or the university, at WITS, obviously you should have the requisite skills and experience, not just be there for the sake of being there. but ideologically influence these places, just as the Zionists have influenced those places. And the 30 million stick that been knocked at UCT and WITS is part of that carrot and stick. And then obviously alliances. Okay, academic, cultural. I think we all know what it would have been like for Gary Player to be in Europe and then have a can of red tomato soup dropped on him symbolically, and the effect that that sort of thing had. We all know about the sanctions and the effect. As Prof alluded to, it wasn't a few lumped minds here and something there. It was a combination of isolation, of embarrassment, of maybe in question and answer time, Prof can say to us how it. Those of us old enough to remember to be called a K or a C. That how you broke down that Engia Kerk mentality that these were communist. We were inherently communist. Black people wanted to drive every white person into the sea and take and rape every white woman. What did it take to break down that mentality? Perhaps the embarrassment, the punishment, the sanctions, the economic cost all put together. And maybe those are the sort of things we can be looking at. So I think that we'll stop it there. I'm going to ask you to put your hand up for question and answers, like Prof. Tons to come back. Please, let's keep it to Palestine. Let's please keep it to Gaza and more focused on what more can we do related to that. If it's a discussion about anything else, we could be here the whole night. Thank you. There's a mic coming around. If you stand up, just maybe perhaps identify yourself if you're from any organization, etc., and ask your question. Please, can I also ask one more thing? Please ask a question. Please don't prelude it with like 5-minute speech. Right? Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry. Good evening. Sorry, my scarf's caught in this chair. Okay. Thank you for an amazing presentation. I noticed that the last slide had a picture of Aaron Bushnell. I just wanted to know, how would you classify that? Like, what is extreme? I mean, that's extreme activism, right? And I'm trying to frame the question. Is it, what is too extreme? Like, what's really extreme? Is it like, when you look at that picture, do you think, did this guy have a mental illness? Should we all be doing that? What should we do, and where's the line, and how not to cross it, or how to cross it? I don't know.
Yeah, that's such a thoughtful question. What interests me about him, he was inside the machine. He was an American soldier. He was in the U.S. Air Force, and he was in the process of being part of the group that were going to be then part of the bombing missions on Gaza, and he was just like, no. And so he chose to do something that is one of the most extreme forms of political protest we know, which is self-immolation. It's a long tradition. Like, people have done it in many conflicts before, but he as an act of protest against the genocide, and specifically in his capacity, in his uniform as a U.S. soldier, he set himself alight and burned himself to death. Now, a lot was done to try and discredit him, and one of the main ways of discredit him is this notion of mental illness. I'm taking that off the table. I'm not even going to discuss that as an attempt to discredit him. The question is, and this is some of the most interesting stuff that I read in response to him. Is the sadness that many other activists felt, and the wish that they could go back to him and invite him into their communities to a path of lifelong activism rather than a path of death. And I think one of the things with genocide is that our reactions to it should be extreme. If our reactions to genocide are not extreme, there's something wrong with us. I really think that. Like, if you can sleep well at night when there's a genocide happening, I think there's something wrong with you. The question is, as you said, it's a question of strategy. It's the response to genocide isn't just to freak out, just to collapse into our emotions, just to become so fired up in rage that we, engage in some random act of violence against someone around us. Those are not helpful. And what we need in a genocide is to be helpful. We need to be sure that what we are doing is actually achieving the outcomes we're trying to achieve and isn't just us freaking out and having feelings and stuff like that. So at the same time, I have this kind of double feeling about Bushnell is a respect that he took the fact that there was a genocide very, very, very seriously. And he gave one of the most powerful symbolic statements against it, but also that perhaps there were alternatives where he could have done even more, which weren't available to him because the people around him weren't making them available to him. And I wish they had. No. I mean, I think he made a very, very powerful statement, and it really influenced people and really shocked people, and it got a lot of people to reframe their thinking. But many people's thinking wasn't reframed because the system that didn't want to understand what he'd done brought in this ideological tool, mental illness. Oh, well, he's got to be crazy. Anyone who kills themselves is crazy. So there was an attempt to make his death meaningless. It was not meaningless, and nothing can make it meaningless. At this to us. It presents to us this idea of absolute desperation and a challenge to say, is there a better path than this? Because this is a terrible path.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. You asked the question, have you stopped the genocide? And you present possibilities of military options, financial, economic boycotts, and then the last one about changing people's minds. I want to ask you the question of, we're looking at ways to stop this genocide, and those of us who are activists, we've tried various things, and genocide will continue. If we want to embark on the process of changing people's minds, that is perhaps the hardest of all of those three options. And the question is, how do we then make it something that all of us can buy into? For those of us who are academics, we're going to a classroom and we pass ideas on to young people, and we hope that they'll take it into the field and change the world. But to be honest with you, the ideological option is really the hardest. So I want to hear from you, how is it that we make it simpler and something that we all can do? I'd like to say more, but I will leave it for that. Thank you.
Can I just add to that question before you answer? Because you talked about vicarious traumatization.
Yeah.
I'm a clinical psychologist and I work in Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. And one of the hardest things we had was working with vicarious traumatization. How do you actually engage people? The group that's sitting here, they know, they speak, they hear, they see, they understand it. The group that's avoidant, they're experiencing vicarious traumatization, having worked worldwide with conflict, I've come across it so many times. To engage that people is one of the most difficult things. As a psychologist, I failed. I tried many times. But with vicarious trauma, and this country, with the crime that happened in country, people are already experiencing vicarious traumatization. They've already got continuous trauma. And then we're talking about having to engage them, to bring them forward, to try and get them to talk and have a different narrative for them. It's really the most difficult. It's hard to build that narrative.
Yeah, and at the point where I got to that slide, I realized I'd been talking for an hour. And so I kind of dropped that. But I'm going to look back to Lubna's question. These are such important and difficult questions. You see, I think you might have the impression that you can ask these difficult questions and I'll have the answer because I'm an expert. But I don't. Like we've got a real privilege in that part of our job is to change people's minds. We literally get paid to stand up in front of students and be like, well, this is why what your folks told you was lies, and this is the truth, okay? I mean, we do it in a fancy way. Actually, in fact, that's a lot of what I do at work, is I explain to people that they've misunderstood stuff and it's making them do bad stuff. And if they understood it better, they wouldn't do that bad stuff anymore. So, how do we do it? It's different in every situation. And I'm not a formula person. This is one of the closest I've ever got in any talks I've ever given to saying, well, like, here's a couple of key points. Like, normally I'm like, whoa. Anyway, it's different in every situation, but a couple of things are true, or a couple of things are useful, is we have to work out how to not just be filled with righteous vengeance and hatred, okay? That is not a useful way in working with people who occupy different positions from us. So we've got to work out how not to do that. Then we've got to do the hard work, and that's really what I wanted to try and do here today, is to say, we've got to imagine our way into their world. Like, what is that world like? It's not like my world. So what is it like on its own inside? What does it feel like to be that person, to believe those things, to have those emotions when you see those images that are not the emotions I have when I see those images? It's not the intellectual reaction I have. We've got to imagine ourselves into their worlds. And that's kind of hard work, because there's not one world. I told you about one world, the kind of Western middle class, late settler colonial, blah, 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 all of that stuff. That's only one world. But it's a world that's controlling a lot of the resources that are running the genocide. So they step back from any impulse to have a fight. B, understand what it is to be in the other person's world and to translate our world into their world in a way that makes our world understandable to them, but not terrifying to them. Because that seems to be a lot of the problem. And this goes back to your question, is people are really traumatized. You know, people are already overwhelmed, they're already traumatized, their lives are already more than they can bear. To say, hey, pay attention to this genocide also on top of your nightmarish life that you're trying to negotiate. No. That's too much. So we've got to do stuff to get them to be okay and to have enough kind of elasticity left in them to say, actually, I can extend my empathy into that particular nightmare and still cope with this nightmare. And that's a lot of work also. So that also involves imagining, well, where are they? And that's your words as psychologists, imagining why the world is so difficult already that it's almost impossible to extend themselves into someone else's suffering. But it's the same principle. It's the same principle of saying, imagine your way into someone whose experience of this is completely different to yours, and who you hate. Okay, maybe we need to say that. Like you need to learn to empathize with people who you just hate and you want to smash their head against the wall. because they've done such terrible things that they need to stop doing. But you need